Hey guys, Sam here at NA Studios. Today I want to take a look at the Slate Digital EQs. I want to take a look at all the EQ plugins that we get in the All Access Pass, and indeed all the ones that Slate Digital offer. I'm aware that they all give very different sounds, and an EQ, you can't just think of it as an EQ. A boost at 10k on one EQ is not going to be the same as another EQ. And I want to see exactly what these EQ curves are and what they're doing, because some of the notation on them is kind of arbitrary. If you look at Fresh Air or Revival or the Lift plugin, for example, they don't tell you how much of a lift it is and where it is. They don't give you numbers. They don't give you hertz and kilohertz. So I want to find out exactly what the curves look like, how they differ, and how they sound different from one plugin to another. Let's check it out. So the plugins I'm going to be taking a look at here are the FGS, that's the SSL emulation, the FGN, that's the Neve emulation, the FGA, which is the API emulation. This is all in Virtual Mix Rack. Then the CSEQ, which is the Custom Series EQ. CS Lift, which is the Custom Series EQ, but just two bands, and you have some buttons there where you can change the frequency. I want to see what they are. Revival, which is in the mastering section, but I want to see exactly what it is it's doing to the sound. I use this a lot, and I want to see what it's doing. AirEQ Earth, this is the low end. There's some great stuff you can do with that. A real lifesaver if you need to bring back some low end where you didn't already have it. Similarly for the Air of the AirEQ, this is doing the same thing as the Earth, but in the top end. This gives you some real top end information where it didn't already exist. Then Fresh Air, which is doing some stuff to the mid-range and high end, but I want to see exactly where those air frequencies are and how they're shaped and what they do. Then the fantastic Infinity EQ. I want to see how flat this actually is. I want to see what these curves are doing, and if the curves that we see on the display actually tally up with the utility plugin that I'm using. And finally, the Eiosis or Eiosis AirEQ. This has more or less been replaced by the Infinity EQ at this point, but it's got some fantastic features that I'm really keen on checking out. That utility plugin is Bertum EQ Curve Analyzer. This allows you to see exactly what the signal is doing, and it allows you to see where the boosts are, where the cuts are. It only shows you the EQ curve, so anything that's going on saturation-wise, harmonic-wise, we're not going to see, but we're going to be able to hear what's happening. So let's start by doing a boost. Let's go up to around 10k, and then let's boost, and let's see exactly where it's happening. Wow, okay, so that's a shelf boost, and that is actually boosting from well below 1k. So that is a real broad shelf. We know with the SSL EQ that we can be really narrow or we can be really broad, but that is a bit of a surprise to me. That is boosting from way below. And up at 10k, if we're boosting, where are we? About 4 decibels, yep, 4 dB. Up at 10k, it's at that 4 dB line, but before that, it's actually boosting absolutely loads, which is really interesting. Let's take a look at the bell. Okay, so the bell is kind of as expected, but if you look at that, we're going at 4 dB at 10k, and it's not actually anywhere near the 4 dB line. It's just at the 2 dB line, which is really interesting. Slate has always said when they're recreating these plugins, when they're making these emulations of analog hardware, that you shouldn't necessarily look at the numbers. If you're comparing this to another plugin of the same type, don't look at the numbers, use your ears. And I think that's really true here, because it's a 4 dB lift, but in terms of the actual curve that it's applying, it's not. So when you're using these plugins, you should always use your ears and make sure you know exactly what's going on. Don't necessarily just look at the numbers. So let's reset that curve then and take a look at the mid-range. So let's just boost, where are we? 3k, let's boost up 4 dB around there at the 3k region. So yeah, we're actually a little bit above. If we turn this up so that it's right on that 4 dB mark, then we're actually just above. So yeah, as we say, it's not going to be absolutely 100% accurate. It may be that the curve analyzer is not 100% accurate, but there's some kind of mismatch there. We've got the Q at the central position, so this is not too sharp, not too blunt. If we take it all the way down to super sharp, wow, that's interesting. Okay, so it doesn't actually just stay at 4 dB. It actually comes down quite considerably as we go to the extreme there. It's only coming up to just beyond 2, so it's maybe 2.5, something like that, maybe getting up to more towards 3. Then as we broaden it out, okay, that's interesting. That gets so broad, that really blunts off, doesn't it? That's really interesting. So it goes up to around 3 dB, and it's still at that 4 dB mark, remember, 4.5 dB even, and it's not actually getting up there. That's really interesting. Let's reset that. I'm going to assume that this one kind of does the same thing. If we take it up to that kind of 3K region, or 2.5K, let's say. Let's take it up by 4 dB. It's going to do a similar thing, I'd imagine. If we take it all the way down, it's going to come down. Yeah, very similar thing. Maybe even more so. Wow. If we take that one up, it's going to broaden out. But check out what it's doing to that low mids here. That's really interesting. That actually changes quite significantly. That comes down about 0.5 dB when we're in about that position. So if we're having the Q on a pretty broad setting and we're at 2.5K and bringing it up by 4 dB, then it's actually cutting out a bit down here. And these characteristics of the EQ are exactly what makes this EQ different to another EQ. If we've got just a surgical boost on one EQ and the next one does exactly the same, what's the point in having two EQs? These characteristics are exactly what set these EQs apart. That's super interesting to see that it's EQing in a different point. Presumably that's what the actual console does, and that's why they've emulated it. But just another reason why you shouldn't just look at the numbers, actually use your ears and see what's going on. Having said that, I've never boosted in this region and heard a dip in this region. So sometimes your ears can deceive you, but I'm assuming that's probably quite true to what's going on in the console. So let's reset those and then take a look at the bottom end. So if we're boosting, let's go down to 100 Hertz, just so we know where we are. And then let's boost, and this is a shelf, remember. Okay, yeah, we can see that shelf. Then let's go to the bell. Wow, that is interesting. So we can see that that's a boost at, what, 9 dB, and it's around 7 dB. It's not actually getting up there, is it? If we go to the shelf again, yeah, so 100 Hertz is getting nowhere near that 9 dB. It's actually at around, what's that, just over 3 at 100 dB, and then below that, it really does come up. So that's super interesting. It seems like a lot of these markings, as we've just said, they're not super accurate. You could really just turn these knobs with your eyes closed and you'd probably get a better idea of what's going on than the actual markings. They're in that region, but remember, it's an emulation. It's not meant to be an exact scientific 4 dB. If 4 dB says it's there, that's where it is. Because if that's not what it did on the hardware, then that's not what we're doing here. That's interesting. Okay, let's take a look at the FGN. So the FGN set to flat. Again, this is quite an EQ curve here. We've got a bit in the low end that it's bringing up, and then in the top end it's bringing it down. If I bring the scale all the way over at 48K, remember I'm at 96 kilohertz here. So up at 48 kilohertz, we're actually dropping down by, what, 5 dB? Wow. I know you can't hear that. I know that's not something that we're really too worried about, but it's interesting to see how the plugin is actually behaving right in that upper end of a spectrum. Let's bring this back down to a more sensible 20 kilohertz so we can see in the usable range. So let's bring up that high end. Wow, again, just bringing up that high end by what? 0.5 dB brings a dip here at around 500 hertz. That's super interesting. Let's bring this up to 4 dB. Wow. Okay, couple of things here. On the markings, it says it's a shelf. Well, if we're looking at this in terms of the curve back down again, it doesn't look like a typical true shelf. A shelf in terms of kind of the name suggests that it's just a flat peak and it extends right up. If we go up to 48K, you can see that's coming down considerably, but it takes until around 42 kilohertz to actually get down to that 0 dB level, so that's interesting. Overall, I think of this as quite an aggressive EQ. I think of this as the SSL is like the normal everyday kind of EQ. If I really want to hear the EQ, then I'm going to go for the Neve every single time. And it kind of suggests that to me, because if we're going, okay, let's say 5 dB, let's take a look at exactly what that's doing. And then we'll go to the SSL and we'll go to 10K-ish, and then we'll go to 5 dB. And just compare the two. That is wildly different. That's incredible. So the SSL is more of a typical shelf that you'd expect to see when you have a shelf denoted. But then if you go to the Neve, that is wildly different. And bringing this up by 5 dB actually brings up almost a 2 dB dip. So 1.3 dB dip at 600 hertz. That's super interesting. Let's see if we can bring that back in, and indeed how much we have to bring that back in using the mid-range. So bring that up. Oh no, it's never going to be quite right, is it? Okay, let's take that high end off. Let's see what that mid-range is actually doing. So when we're bringing up 5 dB, let's say, then it's sitting just above 5 dB. This is kind of what I think of when I see the Neve EQ, that it's going to be a real broad kind of... You think of broad as being gentle, but in terms of a Neve EQ, I kind of think of that as being quite aggressive in the sense that it's affecting loads and loads of frequencies. So aggressive we typically think of as sharp Qs, but in the terms of Neve aggression, I'm thinking of it affects loads of stuff. I'm turning some stuff up at like 1K and it's going to affect the whole of that band. Let's have a look if that's exactly what it's doing. So 1K just turned up by 5 dB. Yeah, it's affecting so much around there. It's turning it up all the way up to, well, all the way up to like 7, 8K. And then indeed all the way up to 100 Hertz as well. That's really, really interesting. Let's take a look at the low end then, because this is what the Neve is known for, having that big bottom end. Let's just bring up some, where are we? 80 Hertz. Let's bring up some of that on a low shelf, 4 dB. Okay, that's as expected here. It's a true shelf in terms of it being kind of flat, but then it has quite a dip here as well in that 600 Hertz region. Wow. Neve really hates 600 Hertz, doesn't it? It brings that down. If we're bringing up the top end, then it brings down the 600 Hertz, and indeed, if we're bringing up the low end, it brings down that 600 Hertz. Can anyone who knows a lot about electronics and kind of console building tell me why that is? That's really interesting. I like to find stuff like that, but I don't like that I can't explain it. That's cool though. So the Neve EQ is very, very broad. We've got no control over the Q factor, but we can see there that it's crazy broad. It's affecting so much. And if we turn up that high end, and let's take a look at where it is over in the very top end. Yeah, it's not as expected in terms of a shelf, but in the kind of audible range, it's bringing up. If we go up to 20 Hertz, then it's still up at, yeah, kind of 6 dB. And where have we got it? Yeah, 6.78. So that's as true as to a shelf as you kind of expect to see. Onto the FGA then. Now this has a few buttons that we can press in to kind of change the curve. On the Neve, I didn't worry about any of the drive or anything like that because I know that it's going to be harmonic stuff, if anything, so I'm not going to actually see it here. But if we take a look at this, we can see that the top end is rolling off over here. And if we bring the op amp in, then it's actually boosting that low end considerably, I'd say, half a dB, 0.7 of a dB. That's enough to make a difference, I think. If we were to just listen to the track, you can definitely hear a bit of a lift there. I think the bottom end is coming up. So without it, I wouldn't say it's necessarily just a bottom end boost. It's kind of an overall boost in the gooiness of it. And it does bring it up just a touch. We're going to see if that makes much difference if we've got stuff boosted and cut as well. That's going to be interesting. So I've never known what this filter button does. Right. Okay, so it takes off the low end and the high end. We'll come back to that. Let's do a bit of a boost at 10K and just see what's going on. Let's go 2 dB. Wow, right on the money. 2 dB. That's interesting. Let's get 4. Right on the money. 6. 9. 12. Okay, that's interesting. So that's maybe the most accurate of the ones that we've seen so far, where what it says on the numbers is exactly what it's doing. That's interesting. Let's go for some mid-range then. Let's go up to 3K and just bring that up and see what's going on. Okay, so if I bring that up to 4 dB, this is really accurate in terms of what's going on the markings. That's really interesting. So let's bring up another mid-range frequency and see how that affects that curve. Okay, so I'm bringing that up at 1.5K and it's just kind of adding to it. Let's go down to 0.8. There's not enough of a difference in those frequencies to expect the curves to be really distinct. Let's go down to 0.2, so 200 Hertz, and bring that up. Okay, that's kind of what we're expecting. 0.6. Yeah, okay. But if we bring this 200 Hertz down, let's see if this peak is affected. Yeah, a very small amount. That's interesting. Okay, so what about if we have those boosts engaged and then we take the op amp out? Yeah, it's what we expected. It's just bringing it down a little bit. So it seems that op amp just kind of boosts it up just a little bit in that low end and across all the way up to, well, I don't know, like 1K, something like that. Let's take those back to 0 so we can see. Yeah, it's around 1K. It's bringing that boost up all the way up to maybe 2K as well. That's interesting. We've got the low frequency on a shelf now. Let's bring that up. Yeah, so it is 4 dB at 100 hertz, and there is an inherent roll-off in shelf design. That's just kind of what happens if you look into it. But that goes up quite a long way. There's still like a over 1 dB boost at 1K. That's quite interesting. So that's doing a similar broad thing to the op amp, but doing it in the low frequencies. What about if we put that filter on? So we can't actually choose the filter frequency, but if we're then bringing up, say, 50 hertz, it's just filtering below it. And as we bring that up, it's going to kind of follow it, is it? No, the filter stays at the same place. That's interesting. So the filter is just notching out some of that real low end. And then if we take a look at the top end, we've got the filter engaged again in the high frequencies, doing a shelf. Yeah, okay, it's dipping it down. Then if we take that shelf off, yeah, that's to be expected. Let's take the filter off and it will go back to a normal shelf. Okay, cool. So let's take a listen to this audio then and see what difference that filter button is actually making to the overall sound. So without the filter, let's bring up some lows. It just kind of tightens stuff up a little bit, doesn't it? It just means that it's not getting that woofy kind of overly bassy sound. That's interesting. This is a great EQ that I often use on like guitars because, well, I don't know. I've just always associated API with having that kind of mid-range characteristic that I think would work well on guitars. But seeing it here, it seems that it's actually just really precise, and the bottom end seems quite nice in it as well. If we compare that to, let's go for the SSL. So let's do some similar boosts and cuts here. So let's go 4 dB at, let's go 100, and then let's go 4 dB at 10K as well. Let's just change this. So we've got these both on shelves. These are on the shelves, and these ones have not got the bell engaged, so they are shelves as well. Let's take a listen to the API first, and then the SSL. Wow. Hit that high end. Okay, so if we haven't got the filters engaged, let's take a listen. Okay, that's interesting. So to me, that SSL is actually brighter and a bit less in the bottom end. The API has a bit more in the bottom end, and the high-end extension is slightly less. It doesn't go up quite as far. So actually what I was thinking about the API having that mid-range focus sound is not necessarily as true as I maybe thought. I think the SSL has maybe got a bit more in those high mids. That's really interesting for me to hear. So now let's take a look at the CS EQ. This is the custom series EQ, and I'm led to believe that this has got some filters in it that are all kind of taken from different EQs, and it's just a bit of a Frankenstein EQ. I could be wrong about that, but I find it useful on buses. I find that the limitations of the frequencies are actually not as limiting as I kind of thought, because you've just got to use your ears and see, well, a high-end boost is a high-end boost, so let's just see how it sounds. You can't actually change any of the frequencies other than, you know, no modifier keys or anything will change them. It's the top end is either 10, 12 or 15. Let's see exactly what this is doing. So let's boost up. We've got this turned on. Let's boost up at 12K and see what's happening. Okay, I always thought it was a shelf, but it's not, it's a bell. So there we're at about 6 dB, here 6 dB, yeah, okay, cool. So that's pretty accurate to what it says. Let's take a look at the low end, 100 hertz, let's bring it up. Wow, that's far steeper. So let's go up to 5 dB or thereabouts. It's actually wildly different than that, isn't it? It's actually up at like, yeah, if we're looking at 100 hertz, which is where we are, then you're actually at around 8 dB. That's interesting. So you've got far bigger boost than I kind of anticipated. What about these filters? How do they work? So let's bring the boost down. Okay, that's to be expected with the roll off. And then that's kind of got a bit of a dip around here as well. So I guess that's maybe almost doing that pull tech kind of thing where it boosts and then you cut just after it. That's quite interesting. Let's see if the top end does that as well. Let's boost and then cut. No, that's actually not doing that. I was expecting there to be kind of a dip around this sort of area, I guess. Interesting. So that is more of a true kind of high cut than the low cut is, or a true low pass than the high pass is if we're using these notations. So let's reset that and then let's just take a look at the mid-range. Okay, so the mid-range actually boosting that 4K by 4 dB is actually boosting the very top end as well. That's interesting. Let's see how far it goes. Yeah, so it's boosted flat actually all the way up to 48K. That's interesting. Wicked. I like that. So it's actually given a considerable boost to the overall top end as well. But if you look at this, I've got nothing else on. I've got no gain there. It's just 5 dB at 4K. And look at this in the low end. That's like a dB up across the board. When I bring that back down to 0, it all goes down again. That's interesting. So bringing up a mid-range boost is actually boosting up absolutely everything as well. Let's see how that sounds. So let's boost up that 600 Hertz and see if we can hear the difference in that low end that the curve was telling us we should be hearing. Definitely. Yeah, I can definitely hear that. And I would never have heard that had I not seen it on the curve EQ. That's really interesting. Let's see if it's doing it in the top end as well. If I go to 2K, kind of mid-range region, let's see if it's bringing up that low end. I feel like it is. I feel like it's bringing up a lot of the very high end as well. Let's take a look. Yeah, it is. It's bringing up the low end and it's also bringing up the high end quite considerably at what, like 3 dB? Okay, so it seems like with these curves that although it's affecting that one central frequency significantly and it's doing a good job of it, it sounds great, it's actually affecting absolutely everything as well. So this is not an accurate EQ, I wouldn't have said. Or it's accurate in terms of frequency because this is kind of at 2K, you know, maybe a little bit above, and it's doing a boost that we would kind of expect, you know, 7, 8. When it gets in that area, it's a bit arbitrary anyway. But it's actually just boosting the low end and the high end as well, regardless of whether we're boosting it. I wonder if we turn these off, if that changes anything. No, so they're just not engaged at all. Okay, so boosting 2K by, let's go crazy, 10 dB is actually boosting the low end by 2 dB and then the high end as well at 20K by 4 dB. Wow, that's super interesting. I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting this one to be like a real gentle, just what it says on the tin, but that's actually, that seems like quite colourful in the sense that it's affecting more than we're just telling it to affect. Nice. Let's have a look at CS Lift then, because this one is kind of closely linked to the Equaliser, I guess. So starting off, it's completely flat. It's not adding anything at all. Present, big, punchy. No, absolutely nothing that is adding there at all. Let's see if we just bring the output up, if it's linear, if it's not actually affecting the bottom end more than the top end or vice versa. No, it's not, is it? Even at extreme settings, that's pretty linear. Okay, cool. Let's take a look at these present and silky and the buttons there. I'm assuming present is going to be a lower frequency than silky. Let's find out though. Let's just go up to like 4 dB-ish. Okay, so that's at, well, you could say that's kind of 4K presence. Yep, yeah, it's kind of presence, isn't it? And then silky, I reckon this is going to go up to like 7 or 8. Oh, wow. Okay. That's really interesting. So that's actually just broadened it out and made it so the Q is much wider. So it's far greater bandwidth there. And it is, in fact, affecting the high end more as well. So it's not that the notch actually moves. It just kind of broadens out. Let's see if that's true in the high region as well. Yeah, okay, so the actual boost around that kind of 4K region stays relatively similar within half a dB, and then silky just brings up that high end above it. Okay, did not know that. Let's take that down, let's try the low end, let's try big. So big is probably going to be a lower frequency, I'd imagine. So what are we at? Let's take it up to 5. Then let's go to punchy. Whoa! Okay. So whereas present to silky went relatively tight Q to broad Q, big is a relatively broad Q, and then punchy is a super tight Q at well, it's 100 hertz, isn't it, really? Just below. I've got to take a listen to this. Okay, let's go big. Pretty big. Let's go punchy. Okay. You can hear that. So in big, it's affecting more frequencies. It's kind of affecting the low end as well. But then punchy is just a bit more precise, a little bit more, I guess you'd say, resonant around that one frequency. And it is indeed 100 hertz. That's interesting. Let's hear this then. Let's go present. Silky, yeah. Okay, so that hi-hat, it kind of remains, there's the presence there still in that kind of chicky 4K region, but then it just extends as well and you just get a bit of the extra information on the top end. So that's silky. Without it. Cool, so present is that presence area, that 4K region, and then silky is that 4K region and then everything else above it as well. Okay, that's good to know. Let's see how that compares to Revival though, because out of the two dial modules in Virtual Mix Rack, I find myself using Revival a lot more. I find myself using it on drums where I want to get like the beefiness and that kind of crack in the top end. So I want to see how those two compare. So here's Revival, and we can see that it's not adding anything, just as it stands, nothing really going on there, except something in the really low end. I'm assuming that's probably a glitch in the curve analyzer, but it might not be. Let's just take it up just so we can get rid of that. Okay, so let's bring up some shimmer then. I think this is like a really high shelf. Yeah, wow, super high. Wow, okay. Let's bring this over a bit so we can see exactly, and that doesn't stop going. At 30k, that is still at like 8 kilohertz. Blimey, that is absolutely loads. And then as we get into the really extreme settings, it's taking out some of the low end as well and creating a bit of a weird curve. Okay, that's super interesting. So let's bring that back down to 0. What about the bottom? What about the thickness? Okay, again, yeah, a shelf. Wow, okay, so I didn't think that's what this was. I always thought, without seeing the curves, I always thought this was like a bell curve kind of thing. But that is like the shelfiest of shelves. Wow. Okay, and the thickness as well. So let's compare like a boost in the high end, about midway up in Revival, and then let's put it on CS Lift and see how those are different. That is night and day, isn't it? Such a massive difference there. So CS Lift, the custom series Lift, is far more of the bell that I thought that Revival actually was. But then if we look at Revival, that is really smooth, even if we go all the way up. Wow, the low end's only going up to like 4 dB, and then the high end just extends all the way up. Remember, I'm at 96k here, so I'm seeing what's happening after 20 kilohertz. That's really interesting. I want to take a listen to this now, because if that's as smooth as it says it is, then that's pretty smooth. Yeah, real high-end stuff. The lows. Yeah, this loop almost doesn't have enough low-end content for that really to take effect. This is just an Apple loop, whatever was first in the list on Logic. That high-end, that's really, really super sweet, isn't it? And if we compare that to CS Lift, even in the silky, let's take that all the way up. Head to Revival. Yeah. Shimmer, well, is exactly what it says. It's just that real top-end shimmer. That's really interesting. So that is just that super, super high-end information. But then as we get into the extreme settings, anything past, what we're saying, sort of getting up to halfway, we start seeing a bit of a dip down in this 1K and below area. Then as we get up to the top, that really comes down to 1.5 dB. And then thickness, does it do the same in the top end? No, it doesn't. It actually boosts, wow, okay, it boosts the top end until we get to around there, which is 23 or 24. Then after that, it starts coming down. Okay, that's interesting. So that Revival is really a shelf equalizer. And I guess that makes sense because it's actually in the, I believe it's in the mastering section. Yeah, Revival and Trimmer. I think it's also in harmonics potentially. Yes, we've also got Revival there. So that really is just like a high and low shelf thing. I can see that being really super useful in mastering if you're just bringing up the very, very high end, just want to kind of shine something, but you don't want it to be too intrusive. I'm going to have to try that. Often you'll have a master where you just want to make it brighter, but you don't want anyone to kind of notice that you've EQ'd it. You just want it to be brighter. I think that's going to be really interesting in that kind of scenario. Right, now we get to the really interesting ones. AirEQ Earth, and then afterwards AirEQ Air, the top end. This is like a sub-harmonic generator thing. I think I'm right in saying that. It's when you don't have a lot of low end in a source, but you really want to give it a load, it's going to give you so much. And whether it's doing that through harmonics or whatever it is, we can only see the curve here. But I know this as really good on toms, really good on kick, bass guitar, when you just want to bring up, that real low end. And it does that using these few controls here. So Earth, if I bring this one up, we're just going to see a load of bottom end. But where is it? Whoa! Okay, again, I think this is just going a little bit crazy. So let's bring that down. So that is like a super, super low shelf. Unbelievably low. Then when we bring it down, okay, that's interesting. If we bring it down, then it's taking out the lows, but also kind of boosting above it. That's interesting. If we set that back to 0 and then go to our low cut, okay, that's it, as expected. It's just kind of a very shallow cut, and then we can alter how shallow or otherwise that is. But then this is where we get really interesting. So let's say we're going to go down to 100 hertz or thereabouts. And if we bring this up, we're going to see this resonance at around 100 hertz. It's going to come right up. There we go, look. All the way up. Crazy, crazy. So the thing that I like to use this for, if I've got a tom, say, and the resonant frequency is at 100 hertz, I can see it on an analyzer, but I can't really hear it or feel it. Then I can set this to kind of just below where I think 100 hertz is, and then bring this up, and it's going to give me all that information around 100 hertz. So it's a real kind of resonant filter, and that's just going to give us that real bottom end. Let's take a listen to that. So with low cut off first, and then we've already got this set, so let's go. Wow, nice. Even lower. Okay, so on Revival, it didn't really have enough in the low end for thickness to actually bring up, but this is just the perfect thing for if you don't have much at all in that low end information, this is going to give you it. This is just going to create it, and that's fantastic. Let's see what it's like if we just have the standard Earth setting. Okay. Then with this engaged, crazy. Okay, so that actual Earth control, that's like a real low shelf, like the lowest of the low, and as you bring it up, you just get far more of it. But it's this, the resonance, that really, really affects stuff. So you bring that down to just below where you think the resonant frequency is, and then boost the resonance, and you're going to get loads and loads in the high end. That's cool. So on the other side of the coin, we've got AirEQ Air, and this is the top end stuff. So presumably it's going to do a similar thing, but let's find out. So if we boost that up, I'm anticipating this is just going to be a real high shelf. Yeah, super, super high, going all the way up. And then if we bring that high cut in, let's bring it all the way up, and let's bring that resonance up. Wow. Then bring that down. Whoa, okay, so that's like a real high boost, like a bell, and then bring this up as well, and we're going to, wow, it just goes crazy. Okay, so that's kind of a real extreme version of what we once saw with AirEQ Earth. This is so good for like bringing up that high end kind of sizzle to stuff. If you don't have it in the first place, in the same way as Earth does to the low end, this will just do it to the top end. You have to kind of be careful with it though, because a little can go a very, very long way. I think that's kind of as expected, really. That's what we expected to see. So the high cut is, yeah, fairly shallow, and then we can make it far steeper, and then we can bring up that resonance. Amazing. Yeah, I think that's kind of as we expected. It's just the real high end, just the kind of mirror image of what the Earth EQ is doing. But we're not finished with high end stuff, because we've got Fresh Air now. And Fresh Air is a really interesting one because we know what it does. We know that it just boosts that kind of not just sibilance, but it boosts the intelligibility of the vocal if that's what you're putting it on. But I've never seen exactly what it is they do. Okay, let's go. Let's go the mid-range. Okay, that's just a shelf. It's a shelf from kind of this range from the 2-3K up. Okay, that's interesting. What about the high air then? Whoa, okay, so that's a high shelf far higher than that. It's kind of at 8K and up. What about if we have them both together? Okay, that's interesting. Okay, a couple of things there then. If we have the high air engaged, then it's actually doing a dip at around the area that the mid air is actually boosting. So that's at what, 4-5K, and then this one is actually bringing that area and upwards up. So if we do them together, there's so many possibilities in there. And then if you link them, as you can just here, you can bring them both up, and that's just going to do... Look at that bottom end go. Whoa! As we get up there, we're like 2 dB up in the bottom end across absolutely everything. I need to hear this. Let's listen to the bottom end. That's adding a load of bottom end, isn't it? That's really interesting. I assumed that it was just air, as it says, just fresh air, but that's actually adding a decent amount in the bottom end as well, and you can hear it. It's not just that it's on the curve EQ, you can actually hear what's going on. Wow, okay, so bringing both of them up is a boost in, the very high end, but then as well in everything else. And just to make sure, is that the same if we do it, each of them separately? Yeah, it is. It's just like crazy amounts. So linking those doesn't actually change the curve at all, as expected. Wow. Okay, that's a far different beast than I thought it was. I've used it in the past to bring up some of the intelligibility on a vocal, bring up some of that high-end sizzle on overheads, but you have to be careful with it. But that's interesting. So it's kind of bringing up everything, but then dipping down in this 3-4K region, and then just going crazy with the high shelf, just for giggles. Yeah, I mean, that's off the scale. Wow, remember 96K, so we're going up to 48K. We can't hear it, but we can see it. And that is just the highest of shelves. Wow, okay, brilliant. Then Infinity EQ. This is the one that I'm anticipating is going to be more what you see is what you get. So if you do a curve on the display that you've got here, and then it's going to be replicated on our curve analyzer. And I think that's probably going to be pretty true. So if we go, what we're going, 1K, 4 dB, 4.6. Yeah, I wasn't anticipating that's going to be anything but that, really. But it's got a few different modes in it, so we can make it a tighter Q. Let's grab it. Yeah, okay. So that changes slightly, but I think that's the just how accurately we can see on this. I don't think that's actually anything on the EQ. Then broadens it. Yeah, wow. That goes up really high. But there's some other stuff, isn't there? So what's this? Okay, yeah, exactly as it says on the tin. And this is reminiscent of the fire and water stuff that we had in the Eiosis EQ, whatever it was called, which I'm going to take a look at in a moment as well. But this is pretty standard stuff. What I'm seeing here is exactly what I thought I was going to see. If we change that to a high shelf, yeah. So I'd say this is like the least coloured of them all. This is the one that if it says that's what it's doing, then that's exactly what it's doing. We don't even really need to hear this because we can see, we know what a high shelf sounds like. We know that if we go up to, what's that, 10 dB? Yeah, I mean, it's number accurate, 10 dB, 10 dB. That is exactly what it says on the tin. Okay. But let's just have a look at this headphone because then we're going to be... Okay, yeah. So even the slope there, when we're just soloing that band, is exactly the same. So that's cool. I guess I'm impressed that it's like exactly the same. I figured it probably would be, but that's cool nonetheless. And then I've chosen to do this Eiosis AirEQ. This was the one that came before Infinity EQ, and I bought the license for this because I thought it looked cool. I thought it looked like a good EQ. I'm kind of anticipating that this is going to do the same thing as AirEQ because the way that it flattened off the peaks on the Q there, I kind of figured that would be the case, and I think it probably is going to be. Let's just add in at like 1.7K, bring that Q up. Yeah, it's doing the exact same thing. We're at 6 dB there, and it's at 6 dB. Yeah, that's going to be really, really true to what's going on. So it was meant to be like I guess you could say a remake of the Infinity EQ, but kind of improved a little bit. And to me, I can't see under the hood, but it seems like it is pretty similar. But there's a few different things that we can do here. Let's just do some fairly kind of arbitrary boosts and cuts here and just see what's going on, just so we can then take a look at these controls over the side here. So we've got water, neutral and fire. If we bring down to water, let's take the fire first actually. That's just going to kind of shape stuff up a bit. That's going to tighten it up. Yeah, we can see what that's doing there. And then if we bring it down to water, that's just flattening it all off and making the curve. Yeah. So if we put on the actual EQ curve here, you can see this curve. It's identical to that one, isn't it? No surprises there. But if we go to our strength, this is the cool one, isn't it? Because, okay, so that's not actually changing on here because it's still the same boosts and cuts. I guess this is maybe, it's not a parallel thing, is it? Because you can go up. That's interesting though. So the strength is, yeah, I guess you could think of that as a parallel. It's just making them a little less. It's actually keeping the slopes and everything relatively similar, but it's just bringing them up and bringing them down. Okay, that's cool. So then the high shelf here, yeah, that's kind of as expected. Yeah, what more can you say about that? It does exactly what it says on the tin in the same way as the Infinity EQ did. That's just cool. It does exactly the same thing. And I guess the Infinity EQ is just like a bit more of a refined remake of that. Although in this you do have the Air band and the Earth band as well. So I've always liked those. I've always thought they were cool. And they're very similar to having the actual bands as we've just seen. Nice. So that's good. Infinity EQ, maybe a bit more refined, but Eiosis, can't pronounce it. Still good in my book. I still use it. So I hope that's been useful for you, going through all these EQs and seeing exactly how the curve changes depending on which EQ you're using. I was surprised by a lot of those virtual mix rack EQs, the FGS, N and A, how drastically different they actually were. It's very easy to think of an EQ as just being an EQ, but as we've seen there, they were so vastly different. Revival was cool for me, just seeing how far out those shelves were and how they can be just like a general sweetening and a general thickening. And then the Infinity EQ, just seeing how precise that actually is, was a bit of a breath of fresh air after seeing all the analogy gooey goodness where stuff isn't really what it says it is. If it's at 2K and a boost of 4 dB, it's not necessarily that because that's an emulation of the hardware and those weren't exactly that. So these emulations are accurate and they're not those either. Interesting stuff. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you again soon. Take care.